Story 1, the cave map changed below level 4. The assignment started as a routine documentation project inside Mammoth Cave National Park during late October, shortly before seasonal flooding forced several lower routes to close for the year. I had been contracted to digitize outdated survey maps stored in the park archive, particularly those connected to abandoned passages no longer included on public tours. Most of the work involved comparing older hand-drawn cave charts against updated geological records. On my third day underground, however, I noticed something unusual while reviewing maintenance maps for the restricted lower sectors. Several tunnel routes beneath level 4 no longer matched one another consistently. Entire corridors shifted position depending on which version of the survey I examined. The deeper maintenance sections of Mammoth Cave felt completely different from the guided tour routes above. Tourist areas still carried reinforced walkways, electrical lighting, and emergency markers positioned every few hundred feet. Below level 4, most of those modern additions disappeared entirely. The passages narrowed into rough limestone corridors thick with mineral moisture and decades of condensation dripping steadily from the ceilings. My assigned guide for the archive work was a maintenance surveyor named Callahan who had spent nearly 20 years navigating the restricted sectors beneath the park. He spoke very little during our descent, though he repeatedly checked the printed cave map clipped against his equipment belt as though expecting it to change. About 2 hours into the survey route, we reached an old junction where 3 separate tunnels branched deeper beneath the cave system. According to the map, the center passage should have terminated less than 50 yards ahead near a collapsed survey shaft abandoned sometime in the early 1990s. Instead, my flashlight revealed the corridor continuing far beyond visible range through descending limestone walls slick with moisture. Callahan stopped walking immediately after seeing it. For several seconds he simply stared at the tunnel without speaking before quietly asking me to confirm what the map displayed. When I repeated the documented dead end aloud, he folded the paper shut almost instantly and said we would continue another direction instead. The atmosphere underground changed subtly after that discovery. Until then, the cave had behaved predictably despite its depth, echoes followed expected distances, air currents moved consistently through connecting passages, and our radio equipment functioned normally. Past the altered junction, however, small irregularities began accumulating faster than either of us openly acknowledged. Footsteps echoed before we finished taking them. Certain tunnels appeared longer returning than they had during entry. Once, while stopping near an equipment alcove, I heard faint conversation drifting somewhere ahead through the darkness despite knowing no other survey teams were scheduled below level 4 that week. Callahan heard it too. I knew because he immediately turned off his radio without explanation. We returned to the archive station near midnight where Callahan finally admitted the lower maps had been quietly revised multiple times over the last decade without official explanation. According to him, survey crews occasionally discovered passages that should not have existed based on previous geological records, only for those same corridors to disappear during later inspections. Most workers blamed navigation mistakes caused by exhaustion or poor visibility underground. Others avoided discussing the subject entirely. Before leaving for the night, Callahan handed me an older folded survey chart removed from public records years earlier. Several sections beneath level 4 had been circled repeatedly in red pencil beside a handwritten warning covering nearly half the page: "Do not continue mapping after the cave begins correcting itself." I spent most of the following morning comparing the older survey chart against the current digital archive stored inside the Ranger Administration office above ground. The inconsistencies were impossible to ignore once I began looking carefully. Entire passage systems beneath level 4 appeared on maps printed decades apart despite supposedly being discovered years later according to official records. Some tunnels changed length depending on the addition being examined, while several junctions existed on one chart only to vanish completely from another. Most disturbing of all were the handwritten corrections scattered through the older documents. Different surveyors had repeatedly marked the same phrase beside altered routes in varying handwriting styles across nearly 30 years, "The cave redirected again overnight." That afternoon, Callahan reluctantly agreed to return underground with me to recheck the corridor that should have ended near the collapsed shaft. The descent felt noticeably colder than before despite stable weather conditions outside Mammoth Cave National Park. Moisture dripped steadily from the limestone ceiling while our flashlight beams disappeared unnaturally fast into the dark ahead, swallowed by depth rather than distance. When we finally reached the junction again, both of us stopped immediately. The center passage was gone. In its place stood a solid limestone wall coated in mineral deposits old enough to suggest it had remained untouched for decades. Yet our boot prints from the previous night still ended directly in front of it. Callahan reacted to the sealed corridor with exhausted recognition rather than surprise. Quietly, he admitted several surveyors over the years had reported similar experiences deeper within the cave system, particularly near sections no longer included on updated maps. Most eventually transferred away from subterranean work entirely. One crew reportedly became disoriented underground for nearly 14 hours despite remaining less than a mile from known routes. According to their statements afterward, certain passages had continued extending while they walked through them. Another surveyor disappeared completely sometime in 2008 after documenting unauthorized tunnel markers appearing below level 4. Official reports blamed flooding, though no body or equipment was ever recovered from the cave. We continued deeper through an alternate route leading toward an abandoned equipment chamber once used during earlier geological surveys. The farther we descended, the less stable the cave seemed acoustically. Echoes arrived delayed or returned from impossible directions entirely unrelated to the tunnel surrounding us. At one narrow limestone crossing, I heard footsteps approaching from somewhere ahead despite both of us remaining completely still. Then came voices, faint at first, overlapping softly beneath the dripping water. One of them sounded unmistakably like Callahan speaking through a radio transmission. The problem was the voice repeated words he had not said yet. Seconds later, Callahan spoke the exact sentence aloud beside me in identical tone and timing. Neither of us acknowledged what happened immediately after the repeated conversation, though the tension between us sharpened visibly from that point onward. Eventually we reached the abandoned equipment chamber marked on the older survey chart, a low cavern containing rusted supply lockers, broken lantern mounts, and outdated geological instruments left behind decades earlier. Scattered across the floor were dozens of laminated cave maps in varying states of water damage and decay. Every single one showed different tunnel layouts beneath level 4. Some contained routes descending far deeper than any official Mammoth Cave survey I had reviewed above ground. Others ended abruptly in blank sections where entire regions appeared intentionally erased rather than unfinished. While examining the scattered maps inside the abandoned chamber, I noticed many carried handwritten annotations documenting dates far into the future beyond the current year. Several described route collapses and maintenance closures that had not yet occurred according to official park records above ground. Others contained increasingly frantic notes about tunnel systems changing position during active surveys. One map in particular unsettled me more than the others because it listed both my name and Callahan's beside a sketched route descending beneath an unmarked shaft identified only as correction level. According to the notation, the survey team assigned to that route had failed to return after continuing beyond a passage labeled "Map Deviation Begins Here." Callahan finally admitted the cave's lower sectors had unofficially frightened maintenance crews for years, though the park administration discouraged formal discussion to avoid attracting attention or unauthorized exploration. According to him, Mammoth Cave occasionally behaved less like a fixed geological structure and more like a system actively reorganizing itself beneath observation. Surveyors who spent too much time mapping below level 4 reportedly began experiencing recurring disorientation even above ground, misremembering room layouts, following incorrect roads home, or discovering written notes in their own handwriting they did not remember creating. The deeper routes don't like permanent records, Callahan said quietly while staring toward the dark tunnel beyond the chamber entrance. Eventually the cave starts correcting whoever keeps trying. We decided to return immediately after that conversation, but the route back to the junction no longer matched the path we had used entering the chamber earlier. Narrow passages branched unexpectedly where solid walls should have been while familiar turns terminated abruptly in dead ends coated with undisturbed mineral deposits. Even Callahan appeared unable to navigate confidently now. The deeper sections of Mammoth Cave had become unnaturally silent except for distant dripping water echoing through unseen corridors far below us. Then, somewhere ahead in the darkness, our flashlight beams illuminated reflective tape markers identical to those attached to our own equipment packs. Each one carried fresh numbering written in black marker continuing sequentially from our current route log. The numbered markers led downward through a descending limestone corridor neither of us remembered entering before. Along the walls, handwritten survey notes had been scratched directly into the rock surface itself in hurried overlapping layers. Some warned against continuing deeper while others repeated directional instructions contradicted only a few feet later by new markings. Eventually we reached a wider cavern where dozens of old flashlight beams glimmered faintly across the floor ahead. At first I thought abandoned equipment reflected our lights through moisture. Then I realized the beams were moving. Figures stood deeper inside the chamber carrying survey lamps, though none of them turned fully toward us. Every silhouette appeared occupied drawing maps against the cave walls. One of the figures finally looked up as we approached closer through the cavern. The face beneath the survey helmet belonged unmistakably to Callahan, except noticeably older and thinner than the man standing beside me. Around him, other surveyors continued sketching tunnel routes across limestone surfaces already covered in previous maps layered endlessly atop one another. Some of the drawings extended into impossible geometric patterns descending far beyond documented cave depth. Older Callahan spoke without surprise upon seeing us. He calmly explained that survey teams who continued mapping after the cave noticed itself being recorded eventually became incorporated into the correction process. The cave keeps reorganizing the people too, he said quietly while continuing to draw another shifting tunnel line across the wall. We escaped Mammoth Cave shortly before dawn after following emergency airflow currents upward through maintenance shafts neither of us later managed to relocate on official maps. Park administration dismissed our reports as exhaustion-induced disorientation caused by prolonged exposure underground, though Callahan resigned from subterranean survey work less than a week later without explanation. Months afterward, while reviewing archived geological records for unrelated projects, I discovered several newly updated maps beneath Level 4 added quietly into the national database. Most changes were minor. One was not. A recently documented survey chamber now appeared deep within the restricted sectors labeled with an official maintenance designation never previously recorded. The chamber's title consisted of only 2 words typed neatly across the map margin: Callahan Station. Story 2: Nobody entered Salt Chamber after winter. I first heard about Salt Chamber while documenting abandoned mining routes connected to Mammoth Cave National Park during late February, shortly after winter flooding forced several lower passages to close indefinitely. Most of the old saltpeter tunnels had been sealed decades earlier due to structural instability, though local maintenance crews still performed occasional inspections near the outer branches. During one of those inspections, I noticed something strange on the archived route chart stored inside the maintenance office. Every mapped mining corridor carried standard identification labels except for one narrow branch left completely unnamed. Someone had intentionally scratched the designation away from every copy of the map using thick black ink and knife marks deep enough to tear the paper itself. The unnamed branch extended beneath one of the oldest abandoned saltpeter sectors inside Mammoth Cave, originally excavated during the early 19th century when miners extracted nitrate-rich soil for gunpowder production. Most of those tunnels had long since collapsed or flooded naturally over time, leaving only fragmented maintenance access routes remaining navigable. When I asked several local workers about the missing chamber designation, the reactions unsettled me immediately. Conversation stopped entirely each time the subject surfaced. One older maintenance guide quietly folded the map shut and advised me not to request access permits for that section after winter season officially ended. He never explained why. He simply repeated the phrase exactly twice: nobody enters Salt Chamber after winter. The deeper mining passages felt older than the surrounding cave system in a way difficult to explain rationally. Unlike natural limestone corridors shaped gradually through geological processes, the abandoned saltpeter tunnels carried visible evidence of human excavation everywhere: pick marks across the walls, collapsed timber supports, rusted rail fragments partially submerged beneath mineral runoff. My assigned escort for the inspection route was a cave worker named Merrick who had spent most of his life navigating Mammoth Cave's maintenance sectors. He spoke openly enough about flooding risks and unstable rock formations, but the moment we approached the unnamed branch entrance, his behavior shifted noticeably. Without explanation, he stopped walking and lit a second lantern despite our headlamps functioning perfectly. The entrance to the unnamed tunnel had been marked with dozens of overlapping chalk symbols drawn directly onto the limestone walls surrounding the passage. Some resembled old mining markings while others looked more like ritual instructions repeated layer after layer across decades of maintenance visits. Small bundles of burnt candle wax and blackened lantern wicks sat arranged carefully beside the tunnel opening as though regularly replaced. Merrick noticed me examining them and quietly explained that local workers refreshed the markings every winter before the flooding season reached the lower sectors. According to him, the ritual had existed longer than official park administration itself. "You acknowledge the chamber," he said carefully, "so it remembers you stayed outside it." I initially assumed the warnings surrounding Salt Chamber belonged to ordinary Appalachian superstition preserved among older cave workers through generations of inherited storytelling. That assumption lasted until we reached the first maintenance checkpoint deeper within the abandoned branch. The tunnel beyond should have continued another quarter-mile according to the archived mining surveys. Instead, a heavy iron gate sealed the corridor completely, its surface covered in hundreds of carved names scratched into the rusted metal from both sides. Most had been crossed out repeatedly with thick lines gouged deep into the iron itself. At the center of the gate, written carefully in fresh white chalk far newer than the surrounding marks, were 4 words positioned directly at eye level: "Do not answer inside." I asked Merrick who the carved names belonged to, but he avoided answering directly while checking the lantern flame beside the gate. Eventually he admitted most of the markings came from former miners, maintenance workers, and survey crews assigned to the abandoned saltpeter branch over the last century. According to him, the names were not memorials. They were acknowledgements. Every worker entering the lower sectors during winter season traditionally carved their name into the gate before turning back. Those who failed to leave a mark were later added by someone else. "It matters that the chamber knows who stopped," Merrick explained quietly. "Otherwise it keeps listening for them underground after the flooding starts." Beyond the iron gate, faint sounds drifted intermittently through the tunnel despite the heavy rusted barrier remaining fully sealed. At first I assumed groundwater moved somewhere deeper inside the abandoned branch. Then the noises became more distinct. Voices echoed softly through the limestone corridor ahead, distant enough to remain unclear but close enough to recognize as conversation. Several sounded layered together beneath dripping water and shifting rock. One voice eventually separated itself from the others long enough for me to distinguish individual words. It was calling someone's name repeatedly in slow, uneven intervals. Merrick reacted immediately upon hearing it. Without hesitation, he extinguished the second lantern and ordered me not to respond no matter what I thought I recognized. The return trip through the mining tunnels felt noticeably longer than our descent despite following the same maintenance route back toward the upper sectors. Several times I caught faint movement deeper within side passages running parallel to us beyond collapsed timber supports and flooded rail tracks. Merrick noticed me looking each time but never turned his own flashlight toward the motion. Eventually he admitted workers avoided Salt Chamber after winter because the flooding season changed the acoustics throughout the lower cave systems. According to him, voices from deeper sectors sometimes traveled incorrectly once underground water levels rose high enough. "The chamber doesn't call strangers," he said quietly while continuing forward through the dark. "It calls people already connected to it." Later that evening, I reviewed archived incident reports stored inside the Mammoth Cave maintenance office hoping to find some rational explanation behind the inherited ritual surrounding the chamber. Most documents avoided mentioning the unnamed branch directly, though scattered references appeared throughout older accident reports dating back nearly 70 years. Several workers had reportedly disappeared while inspecting flood damage near the abandoned mining sectors during late winter months. None of the reports described cave-ins or confirmed fatalities. Instead, Nearly every statement repeated the same unsettling detail: the missing workers were last heard responding to voices coming from beyond sealed maintenance barriers where no personnel should have been present underground. Near midnight, I returned alone to the archive room searching for older mining records overlooked earlier in the day. Buried inside a damaged storage drawer beneath collapsed maintenance ledgers, I discovered a collection of handwritten journals belonging to 19th-century saltpeter workers originally stationed in the lower tunnels. Many entries described ordinary mining conditions until the final pages, where the writing became increasingly fragmented and repetitive. Several miners claimed voices had begun emerging from unfinished excavation shafts during the first flood season after winter closure. According to the journals, workers initially believed trapped miners were calling for rescue deeper within the cave. Then the voices started speaking in the exact tones of people still standing beside them underground. The oldest journal ended abruptly midway through a sentence describing an emergency closure of the lower mining branch after repeated incidents involving workers abandoning excavation routes during flood season. Tucked inside the back cover, however, was a loose sheet containing a hand-drawn map far older than the official Mammoth Cave surveys stored elsewhere in the archive. Unlike modern charts, this one labeled the unnamed tunnel directly. The designation written across the branch in faded ink read, "Salt Chamber Listening Corridor." Beneath it, another sentence had been added later in different handwriting: "Floodwater carries the voices farther every winter." Someone had then attempted to scratch the entire phrase away hard enough to tear through the paper itself. The following morning, I confronted Merrick about the journals and the original chamber designation. For several seconds he simply stared toward the cave entrance beyond the maintenance office before finally admitting local workers no longer used the chamber's real name aloud underground. According to him, earlier generations believed the abandoned mining branch gradually learned voices repeated inside it through decades of echo distortion and flood acoustics carrying sound deeper into unmapped sectors below Mammoth Cave. Over time, the chamber supposedly stopped repeating words randomly and began returning them selectively. "That's why the names stay sealed now," Merrick explained quietly. "Once the chamber learns your voice clearly enough, it starts trying to continue the conversation." Against Merrick's advice, I accompanied a small winter inspection crew back toward the abandoned branch later that afternoon after heavy rainfall triggered new flooding concerns throughout the lower cave systems. The deeper passages felt unnaturally warm compared to previous descents, thick with mineral humidity and slow-moving underground air currents carrying faint echoes through the limestone corridors ahead. Long before we reached the Iron Gate, voices had already become audible beneath the dripping water. At first they resembled distant conversations layered together without clear direction. Then one of the maintenance workers suddenly stopped walking. Somewhere beyond the tunnel ahead, his daughter's voice quietly asked why he had never come back after the last flood season inspection. The worker nearly answered immediately before Merrick grabbed his shoulder hard enough to pull him backward from the corridor entrance. The reaction throughout the group was immediate and rehearsed. Every lantern except one was extinguished while several workers began redrawing fresh chalk symbols across the limestone walls surrounding the gate. Nobody explained the ritual aloud. They simply moved with the practiced urgency of people maintaining inherited procedures they no longer fully understood themselves. Behind the sealed barrier, the voices grew clearer as floodwater rushed deeper through the mining tunnels beyond. More names followed now, spoken softly in familiar tones belonging to relatives, co-workers, and missing surveyors long presumed dead beneath Mammoth Cave. Then the Iron Gate started vibrating. Not violently. Slowly. As though pressure from the flooded tunnels beyond had shifted something heavy against the opposite side. The carved names across the rusted metal trembled beneath our lantern light while voices continued speaking calmly through the corridor ahead. This time I heard my own voice among them. It called softly from beyond the gate asking Merrick why I had been left inside the lower branch alone. The horrifying detail was not merely hearing myself. It was hearing the exhaustion in the voice, as though it had been repeating the same conversation underground for years. Merrick immediately ordered everyone to leave before the flooding rose higher into the listening tunnels. By morning, the lower mining branch had been sealed indefinitely after floodwater collapsed several maintenance corridors leading toward Salt Chamber. Official reports blamed unstable limestone and seasonal erosion, though no mention of the listening corridor appeared anywhere in the final documentation. Merrick retired less than 2 months later and refused further subterranean work inside Mammoth Cave National Park. Before leaving, however, he mailed me a small package containing the old hand-drawn mining map recovered from the journals. Across the chamber designation, someone had recently added a final handwritten note in fresh white ink: "The voices stop during summer because the water cannot carry them upward." Beneath the sentence, carved lightly into the folded paper itself, was my full name repeated several times in my own handwriting. Story 3: The underground chapel continued holding services. I arrived at Mammoth Cave National Park during the second week of November after repeated electrical failures forced several lower maintenance sectors to close unexpectedly. Most outages affected unused infrastructure beneath older tourist routes no longer open to the public, particularly around abandoned service corridors scheduled for permanent decommissioning before winter. My job was straightforward: inspect damaged wiring, restore emergency lighting where possible, and verify whether flooding had compromised the underground electrical systems. I had worked maintenance contracts in mines, hydro tunnels, and municipal utility systems for nearly 15 years, so underground environments no longer unsettled me much. Still, the deeper sectors beneath Mammoth Cave carried a silence unlike any structure I had worked inside before. The lower maintenance routes beneath the park were accessed through narrow service corridors hidden behind locked utility doors far below the main tourist chambers. Most visitors never realized how much outdated infrastructure remained buried beneath the public sections: old electrical conduits, abandoned ventilation systems, maintenance rail lines, and sealed storage rooms dating back decades. My assigned supervisor underground was a facilities coordinator named Bellamy who handled seasonal closures throughout the cave system. He spoke constantly during our descent, mostly discussing flood risks and unstable wiring conditions, but his tone changed noticeably once we entered the oldest maintenance sector near the restricted southern chambers. Without explanation, he asked whether I had ever worked inside buildings where sound continued after power failed. The first outage site sat beside an abandoned limestone corridor once connected to historical tour routes closed sometime during the 1970s. Emergency lights along the passage flickered inconsistently despite receiving stable voltage from the nearby control panels. While inspecting damaged conduit lines near the ceiling, I noticed something strange farther down the corridor. Wooden church pews had been arranged neatly inside a recessed cavern partially hidden behind maintenance tarps and storage barriers. At first I assumed the area belonged to some historical exhibit awaiting removal, though the pews appeared recently cleaned despite the thick mineral moisture coating everything else underground. Beyond them stood a small stone altar illuminated faintly by candles burning where no electrical power should have existed. Bellamy reacted immediately when he realized I had seen the chapel. He pulled the maintenance tarp closed almost instinctively before quietly explaining the cavern had once been used for underground church gatherings during the early 20th century when portions of Mammoth Cave hosted historical tours and local events. According to him, the chamber was scheduled for structural sealing years earlier after repeated flooding weakened the surrounding limestone supports. The problem was the electrical failures always returned whenever crews attempted permanent closure work near the old chapel sector. He tried explaining it practically: water damage, unstable wiring, poor ventilation, but his voice carried the careful restraint of someone avoiding a different explanation entirely. We remained underground far longer than expected after another circuit failure disabled emergency lighting throughout the southern maintenance corridors. For nearly 20 minutes, only our handheld lamps illuminated the cave while Bellamy worked silently beside the breaker panels near the chapel entrance. Then, somewhere deeper beyond the concealed cavern, faint music drifted through the darkness. At first I assumed water pressure inside the pipes distorted airflow through the tunnels. Gradually the sound clarified into distant hymns singing layered beneath slow echoing footsteps. Bellamy stopped working immediately upon hearing it. Without looking toward the chapel, he quietly told me the lower sectors always lost power during the same week every year. "The services start after the lights fail," he said. The hymn singing continued intermittently while Bellamy restored power to the lower maintenance grid, though neither of us acknowledged it directly after his comment about the annual outages. Once the emergency lights finally stabilized, the music stopped almost immediately, leaving only dripping water echoing through the limestone corridors surrounding the chapel sector. Before we returned above ground, however, I noticed something unsettling inside the concealed cavern beyond the tarp. The stone altar now held fresh candles that had not been there earlier during my inspection. Several pews also appeared damp, as though recently occupied by people wearing rain-soaked clothing. Bellamy refused to look inside when I pointed this out. He simply resealed the tarp and locked the corridor gate behind us. The next morning, I reviewed historical maintenance records hoping to identify previous flooding incidents connected to the underground chapel. Most documents described ordinary structural concerns until I located older reports dating back to the late 1960s, shortly before the southern tour routes officially closed. According to the archived statements, a sudden underground flood had trapped a small religious gathering inside the chapel sector during an evening service attended by local families and several tour staff members. Rescue crews eventually recovered the chamber days later after water levels dropped throughout Mammoth Cave. Curiously, however, none of the reports clearly listed how many bodies had actually been found underground. Several sections had been removed entirely from the archived files. Later that afternoon, Bellamy reluctantly escorted me back toward the lower maintenance sectors after another unexplained outage disabled power near the chapel corridor again. The deeper tunnels felt noticeably warmer than before despite cold November temperatures above ground. Moisture collected heavily along the limestone walls while condensation dripped steadily from the overhead electrical conduits in irregular patterns almost resembling footsteps following us through the passage. As we approached the concealed chapel entrance, I heard faint movement ahead long before reaching the corridor itself, wood scraping softly against stone accompanied by distant conversation echoing beneath the dripping water. Bellamy stopped walking immediately after hearing it. "They rearranged the pews before service nights," he said quietly. This time the tarp covering the chapel entrance had already been pulled partially open before we arrived. Beyond it, candlelight flickered across the cavern walls despite the emergency grid remaining disconnected throughout the entire sector. The chapel itself appeared impossibly preserved compared to the surrounding tunnels. Wooden pews stood aligned neatly facing the altar while hymn books rested open beside several seats as though recently handled. Even stranger, electrical lanterns mounted along the limestone walls inside the cavern glowed faintly without visible power sources attached. Then I noticed the wet footprints crossing the stone floor between the pews. Dozens of them led inward toward the altar. None led back out. Bellamy finally admitted the chapel sector had never remained permanently empty after the flood disaster decades earlier. Maintenance workers assigned to the lower corridors routinely reported hearing hymn services underground during the same week each November when seasonal flooding first intensified throughout Mammoth Cave. Some claimed they saw figures seated inside the pews whenever the power failed near the southern chambers. Others refused to enter the corridor entirely after hearing their own names spoken softly during the singing. According to Bellamy, the park administration repeatedly attempted sealing the cavern over the years, but every effort ended the same way: collapsed equipment, electrical failures, rising floodwater, and hymn music continuing underground long after evacuation orders cleared the lower sectors. Heavy rain reached Mammoth Cave later that evening, forcing emergency closure procedures across several lower maintenance sectors as underground water levels began rising faster than expected. Bellamy and I were assigned to disconnect remaining electrical systems near the chapel corridor before floodwater reached the southern junctions entirely. The deeper we descended, the louder the hymn singing became beneath the tunnels surrounding us. This time the voices no longer sounded distant. They echoed clearly through the limestone passages ahead in layered harmony accompanied by slow deliberate footsteps moving across stone floors. When we reached the concealed chapel entrance, the tarp barrier had been removed completely. Warm candlelight spilled openly into the maintenance corridor while the music continued somewhere inside the cavern beyond. The chapel was fully occupied. Figures sat motionless throughout the pews wearing dark water-stained clothing reflecting faintly beneath the candlelight. None turned toward us when we entered the cavern, though the singing continued uninterrupted from every row surrounding the stone altar. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling onto him. Books spread across the pews while old electrical lanterns along the walls flickered weakly without connected power. Bellamy stood frozen beside the entrance, staring toward the congregation with exhausted recognition rather than panic. Quietly, he admitted he had attended the final service underground as a child alongside his parents before the floodwaters trapped the chapel sector decades earlier. "The service never finished," he whispered. Near the altar stood an elderly minister continuing the hymn with slow measured calm despite water already pooling across the chapel floor around his shoes. The congregation followed every verse without interruption, though their voices carried a strange drowned quality beneath the cavern acoustics as if echoing upward through deep water. Several faces within the pews appeared unnaturally pale beneath the candlelight, softened by mineral moisture and shadow until their features resembled faded photographs left too long in dampness. Then the minister stopped singing and quietly announced the final prayer before closure. For the first time since entering the cavern, every member of the congregation turned simultaneously toward Bellamy standing beside me near the chapel entrance. Bellamy stepped forward almost automatically after the congregation looked toward him. He later admitted he remembered fragments of the original flood night only as disconnected impressions: cold water rising through the pews, failing lanterns, adults continuing hymns to calm the trapped families underground. According to him, rescue crews reached the chapel too late after structural collapse sealed the southern tunnels completely. The survivors had always spoken afterward as though the service ended unfinished beneath the cave. Now, standing inside the flooded cavern decades later, Bellamy quietly approached the altar while the congregation resumed singing around him. Outside the chapel, deep cracking sounds rolled through the surrounding limestone as flood pressure intensified throughout the lower sectors. Water surged suddenly into the cavern through collapsing maintenance corridors beyond the chapel walls, extinguishing several lanterns while limestone debris crashed heavily into the flooded pews behind us. Still the congregation continued singing. Bellamy reached the altar just as the elderly minister closed the final hymn book resting atop the stone surface. The moment the prayer ended, the entire cavern fell silent. One by one, the figures seated throughout the pews lowered their heads before gradually fading into darkness beneath the failing candlelight and rising floodwater. Then the ceiling above the southern wall fractured completely. Bellamy grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the corridor entrance as the cave itself began collapsing inward around the chapel. We escaped the southern maintenance sectors moments before a massive structural collapse sealed the lower chapel corridors permanently beneath tons of limestone and flood debris. Emergency crews later declared the entire region inaccessible due to catastrophic cave instability caused by the seasonal flooding. No further recovery operations were attempted below the southern chambers after that night. Weeks later, while completing final electrical reports above ground, I noticed something strange in the archived maintenance records connected to the collapse. For the first time since the flood disaster decades earlier, the annual November outage cycle had stopped completely. No hymn singing returned beneath the lower tunnels. No unexplained power failures followed. Deep beneath Mammoth Cave National Park, the final underground service had finally ended. Story 4: The last tour returned with extra people. The final public tour of the Deep Lantern route began just after 4 in the afternoon beneath heavy rain moving across Mammoth Cave National Park. Seasonal flooding had already forced closure of several lower chambers earlier that week, but the Deep Lantern route remained temporarily open until the underground water levels reached the emergency markers near the southern flood corridors. I had guided the route nearly twice a day for most of the autumn season, long enough to memorize every stairwell, railing turn, and limestone passage by instinct alone. That afternoon's group consisted of 9 visitors total, including a quiet young girl named June who spent most of the descent watching the cave walls instead of listening to the tour itself. The first portion of the route proceeded normally through the larger public chambers connected by reinforced walkways and emergency lighting systems installed decades earlier beneath Mammoth Cave. Most visitors stayed close together while moving through the narrow limestone corridors deeper below the surface, especially after the rain intensified overhead hard enough for distant water movement to become audible through the cave ceiling itself. About 40 minutes into the tour, we reached the first flood checkpoint position beside an older service passage no longer included on public maps. While performing the routine head count there, I paused briefly after counting 10 people standing beneath the warning sign instead of 9. I counted again immediately, slower the second time. 9 visitors stood exactly where they should have been along the railing beside the flood marker. Nobody appeared missing. Nobody unfamiliar stood among the group. Even so, the mistake unsettled me more than it should have. Tour guides rely heavily on repetition underground. Eventually you stop consciously recognizing faces because your mind memorizes movement patterns instead. People naturally arrange themselves the same way throughout tours. Certain visitors lead, others hesitate near stairways, children remain close beside parents. That afternoon, however, the formation near the flood checkpoint felt subtly wrong somehow. One position in the group looked occupied despite nobody visibly standing there. We continued deeper after the checkpoint while the rain overhead grew loud enough to send occasional vibrations through the cave walls surrounding the route. The deep lantern passage narrowed considerably beyond that point, forcing the visitors to walk single file beside shallow runoff channels collecting water along the limestone floor. About 10 minutes later, June quietly asked me why we had passed the same emergency sign twice. At first I assumed she meant another identical flood marker positioned elsewhere along the route, but when I looked behind us, the warning sign mounted beside the corridor wall carried the exact same dent across its lower corner as the previous one near the checkpoint passage. The group began noticing the repetition shortly afterward. A middle-aged couple near the back insisted we had already crossed the same narrow footbridge earlier during the descent, while another visitor claimed the cave temperature suddenly felt warmer despite moving farther underground. I tried reassuring everyone that several sections of Mammoth Cave naturally resembled one another due to the limestone formations repeating throughout the lower chambers. Even while explaining it, though, I noticed something that stopped me mid-sentence. Fresh muddy footprints crossed the passage ahead of us near the runoff channel. They moved in the same direction as our group. The problem was the prints already continued deeper into the corridor before any of us had walked there yet. I stopped the group beside the runoff channel and checked the passage ahead with my flashlight, expecting to find another maintenance crew somewhere deeper in the corridor. The muddy prints continued around the bend before disappearing entirely across dry limestone where no water or soil should have transferred at all. Behind me, several visitors had started quietly recounting how many people were standing in the group. I heard different answers almost immediately. Some counted 9. Others insisted there were 10. June remained near the back railing watching the corridor behind us instead of the one ahead. When I asked what she was looking at, she pointed toward the darkness and said, very calmly, "The people behind us keep stopping when we stop." I decided to shorten the route and begin returning toward the upper chambers once the second flood alarm activated somewhere deeper beneath Mammoth Cave. Normally the evacuation signal only triggered after water levels reached the lower emergency markers, which should not have happened for at least another hour. The problem was the corridor behind us no longer looked completely familiar. Several visitors immediately noticed it. The narrow limestone turn leading back toward the checkpoint passage now split into 2 nearly identical corridors positioned side by side. Both carried the same directional signs toward the surface route. Both showed fresh mud along the floor. Even the damaged handrails appeared identical beneath the emergency lighting. Nobody spoke for several seconds after seeing the duplicate corridors. Eventually one of the visitors laughed nervously and suggested the cave designers probably installed parallel evacuation routes for flood emergencies. I wanted to agree with him, but I had guided the deep lantern route for almost 4 months straight and knew with absolute certainty the split passage had never existed before. June quietly asked which corridor we originally came from. I realized immediately that I could not answer her. Worse, the group itself had unconsciously divided while we hesitated. Without meaning to, several visitors had already positioned themselves beside opposite entrances, mirroring each other almost perfectly beneath the cave lights. I chose the left corridor simply because the airflow felt slightly colder coming from that direction, which usually meant proximity to the upper chambers nearer the surface. At first the passage appeared correct. The same mineral stains crossed the walls beside the handrails, and the same flood markers remained painted at shoulder height along the limestone. Then we reached another emergency sign identical to the first checkpoint marker from earlier in the tour. Same warning text. Same damaged lower corner. Same faded maintenance sticker peeling near the bolts. One of the visitors quietly said we had been walking in circles for nearly 20 minutes. Another insisted we had never passed this section before at all. The group's conversations gradually became harder to follow the deeper we moved through the repeated corridors. People began answering questions that nobody remembered asking. At one point, I heard two visitors speaking behind me using almost identical sentence patterns several seconds apart, like an echo repeating conversationally instead of acoustically. Then June tugged lightly on my sleeve and pointed toward the shallow water pool beside the limestone wall. Reflected in the surface beneath the emergency lights stood 10 people. When I looked directly at the group beside me, however, only 9 visitors occupied the corridor. Before I could count again, the reflected figures shifted positions independently from the people standing above them. The flood alarms intensified throughout the lower chambers moments later, cutting through the corridors in distorted bursts while water rushed louder somewhere beneath the limestone floor. I ordered the group to stay together and stop separating near the duplicated turns, but even simple instructions had started becoming difficult to maintain underground. People occasionally paused beside the wrong individuals as though briefly mistaking strangers for members of the tour. Twice I caught visitors turning toward empty sections of corridor while responding to voices that never fully reached me. Then we arrived at another split passage identical to the previous one. This time, however, both corridors already contained muddy footprints moving away from us deeper into the cave. One set matched our group exactly. Panic finally began spreading through the visitors after a woman near the back insisted her husband had been standing beside her moments earlier before suddenly appearing farther ahead near the front of the group without ever passing anyone in between. Others started arguing over how long we had actually been underground. Some claimed less than an hour had passed since the tour began. Others swore the emergency alarms had been sounding most of the evening already. While trying to calm everyone down, I noticed the group formation had changed again. June now stood near the center beside a man I did not remember joining the tour initially. The unsettling part was nobody else appeared to notice him at all. I performed another head count beneath the emergency lights near the duplicated corridor junction. 10 people stood in the group again. This time the number remained consistent no matter how many times I counted. The unfamiliar man beside June wore a dark rain jacket soaked heavily around the shoulders as though he had been standing beneath running water for hours. When I asked quietly which tour ticket belonged to him, several visitors looked confused and insisted he had accompanied us since the surface entrance. One couple even claimed he walked directly behind me throughout most of the descent. June stared at him silently for several seconds before whispering something that tightened every muscle in my body. He wasn't here at the first sign. The realization hit me all at once. The group had not gained an extra visitor randomly underground. Somewhere during the repeated corridors and duplicated turns, everyone had slowly adjusted their memory of the tour itself. The unfamiliar man now occupied a place in the group formation that previously belonged to someone else. I checked the emergency roster clipped beside my belt and immediately noticed a name missing from the handwritten attendance list. Not crossed out. Not erased. Simply absent, as though it had never been written there to begin with. Before I could process it fully, floodwater surged suddenly through the lower corridor behind us, forcing the group toward the nearest marked evacuation route beneath flashing emergency lights. We reached the upper floodgates just as cave rangers began sealing the deep lantern sectors due to rapidly rising water levels throughout the southern chambers. The moment the group crossed into the safer maintenance corridor near the surface elevators, the unfamiliar man stopped walking. Nobody reacted immediately. Several visitors moved past him naturally as though failing to recognize anything unusual at all. Then the emergency lights flickered once across the corridor walls. When they stabilized again, he was gone. No footsteps. No retreating movement. Just empty space where someone had been standing seconds earlier. Behind us, deep within the lower cave system, the duplicated flood passages disappeared beneath rushing black water as the final emergency gates sealed permanently. The deep lantern route never reopened after that night. Structural flooding damaged several lower chambers beyond repair, and large portions of the southern passages were sealed indefinitely following repeated cave collapses during the winter season. Weeks later, Park administration asked me to review the evacuation photographs taken automatically near the upper flood gates during the emergency exit. Every image showed the correct number of visitors from the tour standing together beneath the warning lights. 9 people. No extras. Yet something in the photographs felt deeply wrong the longer I studied them. Near the center of every image stood the same middle-aged visitor wearing a dark rain jacket beside June. According to the original surface records, however, that man had never entered Mammoth Cave with our tour at all. Story 5. The recorder captured conversations before they happened. I arrived at the acoustic research corridor during the final weeks of the season, shortly before winter flooding forced several lower sections of Mammoth Cave to close. My assignment was simple. A university research team had installed monitoring equipment throughout a rarely accessed chamber system known for unusual echo behavior. Recent maintenance reports suggested several recorders were producing corrupted audio files. I had been hired to inspect the equipment, verify the recordings, and replace any faulty hardware before seasonal shutdown began. The work suited me. Most of my career involved troubleshooting microphones, sensors, and data systems. Equipment followed rules. If something malfunctioned, there was usually a reason. The research corridor sat nearly 2 hours from the nearest public tour route. Reaching it required passing through a series of service tunnels used primarily by maintenance crews and scientific staff. The deeper sections felt noticeably different from the tourist chambers above. Sound traveled strangely there. Even simple footsteps seemed to linger longer than expected against the limestone walls. By early afternoon, I had finished inspecting the first 2 monitoring stations without finding anything unusual. The third station contained a recorder that had generated multiple error reports during the previous month. I connected my headphones and began reviewing the most recent audio files. At first, the recordings sounded completely normal. Water dripped somewhere in the distance. Air moved faintly through narrow passages deeper within the cave. Occasionally, I heard maintenance personnel passing through nearby service corridors. About 20 minutes into the review, a voice appeared on one of the files. The speaker sounded unmistakably like me. Through the headphones, I heard myself say, "The battery compartment looks damaged." I paused the recording immediately. The sentence caught my attention because I had not spoken those words all day. Curious, I checked the timestamp. The file had been created nearly 12 minutes earlier. I replayed the recording several times before dismissing it as a synchronization error. Audio systems occasionally produce strange results when internal clocks drifted out of alignment. The explanation seemed reasonable enough. Then I opened the equipment housing beside the recorder. As soon as I removed the protective cover, I noticed a cracked section near the battery compartment. Without thinking, I said aloud, "The battery compartment looks damaged." The words left my mouth before I fully processed what had happened. For several seconds, I simply stared at the recorder. The sentence I had just spoken matched the recording exactly, including the pacing and tone. I contacted the field coordinator, Dana, over the radio and explained what I had found. She suggested documenting the issue and checking the remaining monitoring stations for similar anomalies. The recommendation was sensible, though I avoided mentioning how unsettled I felt. Before leaving the station, I reviewed one additional audio file stored on the recorder. Most of it contained ordinary cave noise. Then, near the end, another conversation appeared. This time I heard Dana's voice asking whether I had reached Station 4 yet. A second voice answered immediately. It was mine. The problem was that I had not visited Station 4, and Dana had not asked that question yet. I reached Station 4 roughly 20 minutes later. The equipment there occupied a narrow limestone alcove position beside a chamber known for producing unusually long acoustic reflections. Before inspecting anything, I opened the recording file I had copied from the previous station. Dana's question appeared exactly where I remembered hearing it. Then the recording continued. "Yes," my voice answered. "I'm at Station 4 now." A few seconds later, I heard myself mention a damaged microphone bracket mounted beside the recorder housing. I looked toward the equipment immediately. The bracket appeared perfectly intact. For a moment, I felt relieved. Then I stepped closer and noticed a fracture hidden along the rear mounting plate. The discovery unsettled me enough to begin documenting every anomaly separately. I photographed the damaged bracket and checked the equipment logs twice. Nothing suggested tampering or outside interference. The station had remained locked for weeks. While reviewing additional recordings, I noticed a pattern emerging across multiple files. The predicted conversations always occurred eventually. Sometimes the gap measured only a few minutes. Other times it stretched nearly half an hour. None of the recordings captured dramatic events or impossible warnings. They documented ordinary dialogue. That normality made the phenomenon far more disturbing. The equipment was not producing random noise. It was accurately recording conversations that had not happened yet. By late afternoon, I contacted Dana again and described the situation more carefully. She listened without interruption before suggesting a software fault affecting the internal timestamps. The explanation sounded reasonable until I asked her a question she had not yet spoken. Silence followed. Then, several seconds later, Dana asked the exact same question I had heard earlier on one of the recordings. The pause afterward felt much longer than it probably was. Neither of us mentioned what had happened directly. Instead, she instructed me to continue the inspection and return to the surface before evening. Her voice remained calm. Mine did not. The farther I moved through the research corridor, the more dependent I became on the recordings. Each station contained another file. Each file revealed fragments of future conversations waiting somewhere ahead. At first, I listened out of curiosity. Then I began checking them before making routine decisions. The habit developed quickly. If a recording suggested I would inspect a certain passage, I found myself walking there automatically. If a future conversation mentioned specific equipment, I checked that equipment first. Gradually, the line between prediction and choice became harder to identify. I could no longer tell whether I was making decisions independently or simply following instructions delivered in advance. Near the end of the corridor sat the final monitoring station, positioned beside a chamber rarely used by researchers because of its unusual acoustic behavior. The recorder there contained only a single audio file. Its timestamp placed it nearly 3 hours into the future. I hesitated before pressing play. The recording began with cave ambience and distant water movement. Then I heard my own voice speaking quietly. "Don't listen to the next file." Several seconds passed. Another version of my voice answered from the same recording. I already did. What followed was not an argument. It sounded like two conversations occurring at once, overlapping each other so precisely that neither voice could be understood completely. I stopped listening after several seconds and removed the headphones. The overlapping dialogue left me with a growing sense of unease that had little to do with the recordings themselves. What unsettled me was the realization that I already recognized fragments of the conversation. Certain phrases sounded familiar despite never having occurred. I copied the file onto a backup drive and prepared to leave the chamber. Before shutting down the recorder, I noticed another audio file had appeared in the directory. The timestamp placed it nearly 4 hours ahead of the current time. I was tempted to ignore it. Instead, I pressed play almost immediately. The new recording contained a conversation between Dana and me. This time the audio was perfectly clear. Dana asked whether I intended to continue reviewing the files after discovering the predictive recordings. My recorded response arrived without hesitation. I kept listening because I wanted to know where it ended. Hearing the sentence produced an uncomfortable reaction. It felt less like prediction and more like confession. As the conversation continued, Dana warned me not to rely on the recordings for decisions. Then the file ended abruptly. Minutes later, my radio crackled to life. Dana contacted me and asked the exact same opening question. The conversation unfolded almost word for word as the recording predicted. By the time it ended, I no longer felt surprised. Instead, I found myself anticipating each sentence before it arrived. That frightened me more than the phenomenon itself. I had started treating the recordings as a reference guide. Every future file reduced uncertainty. Every prediction removed another decision. The corridor felt quieter afterward. Even the cave echoes seemed diminished. While packing the equipment cases, I noticed a final folder hidden within the recorder's storage system. Unlike the others, the folder contained a single file labeled only with the word "Completion." I opened the file and immediately saw the duration listed beside it. 23 minutes. That was longer than every previous recording combined. The timestamp placed it nearly 6 hours ahead of the current time. For several moments, I considered deleting it without listening. Then curiosity won. The recording began with ordinary cave ambience. Footsteps echoed through the corridor. Equipment cases shifted across limestone. Then my voice appeared. Calm. Steady. Resigned. I described reviewing the final file beneath the research chamber lights. As the recording continued, I realized it was documenting events that had not occurred yet. More disturbing still, it was documenting the remainder of my night underground. For nearly 15 minutes, I listened to future conversations unfold through my headphones. Every action appeared in sequence. Every movement. Every radio transmission. At first I searched for mistakes. None appeared. The file predicted when I would sit, when I would stand, and when I would contact Dana one final time before leaving the corridor. Eventually, I stopped trying to challenge it. Instead, I found myself following the recording naturally. The experience felt strangely passive, as though the uncertainty had already been removed from the evening. Then the final section began. My future voice lowered slightly and spoke a sentence that caused me to freeze completely. After this, there are no more recordings. The remaining minutes passed exactly as the file described. I contacted Dana. I packed the final equipment case. I walked toward the service tunnel leading back to the surface. Each event arrived on schedule, matching the recording line for line. Then only one sentence remained. Standing beside the tunnel entrance, I heard my future voice speak through the headphones. This is the last thing you will hear before it stops. A second later, I spoke the same words aloud without meaning to. The recording ended. Silence followed. No new files appeared. No future conversations emerged from the equipment. Months later, investigators found no explanation for the anomaly. The corridor was eventually decommissioned after seasonal flooding damaged the research stations beyond repair. As for me, I never returned. The future had finally run out of recorded sound. Story 6. The floodgate had not been opened in 40 years. I arrived at the abandoned flood control sector during the final inspection cycle before winter maintenance crews suspended operations across several lower sections of Mammoth Cave. The assignment had been delayed for years due to budget concerns and limited access. My job was straightforward. The park intended to evaluate several inactive flood management systems before deciding whether restoration was worth the expense. Most of the older infrastructure had been retired decades earlier. One sector, however, remained sealed behind a series of maintenance doors despite appearing on every official map. The records described it as inactive. What caught my attention was that nobody seemed interested in reopening it. The retired maintenance worker met me near the service entrance shortly after sunrise. Ruth Talbot had spent more than 30 years working throughout the flood control network before retiring. She carried no equipment and showed little interest in the inspection itself. Instead, she spent most of the walk studying the tunnel walls as though confirming they remained unchanged. When I asked why the sector had been abandoned, she gave an answer that sounded rehearsed through years of repetition. The gate stayed closed, she said. That was enough. When I asked what existed beyond it, she remained silent until we reached the first maintenance junction. The deeper corridors felt older than the surrounding cave infrastructure. Most flood control systems had received upgrades over the years. This section had not. Rust covered the valve housings. Emergency lights hung dark above maintenance walkways. Several warning signs had become nearly unreadable beneath decades of moisture damage. Then I noticed the water level markings. Similar markers existed throughout Mammoth Cave wherever flooding occurred. These were different. Painted lines climbed far above normal flood elevations. Some reached the ceiling. Others crossed maintenance doors nearly 20 feet above the tunnel floor. Next to several markings, faded dates had been written carefully by hand. Ruth stopped beside one of the highest markings and stared at it for several moments. The date beside the line was older than either of us. I asked whether the sector had once experienced a catastrophic flood. She shook her head immediately. Not here, she said. Not ever. The answer only created more questions. If the water had never reached those heights, why continue recording impossible levels year after year? Before I could ask, Ruth pointed toward a rusted metal plaque mounted beside the corridor wall. Several words remained visible beneath layers of corrosion. Hold the level. Hold the line. The phrase resembled a maintenance instruction more than a warning. We reached the final access chamber shortly before noon. The floodgate stood at the far end of the tunnel beneath a network of corroded machinery that had not operated in decades. Massive steel doors sealed the passage beyond. Thick mineral deposits covered much of the mechanism. The entire structure looked less like infrastructure and more like a monument abandoned underground. What unsettled me most was the condition of the surrounding area. Despite 40 years without operation, someone had continued maintaining the approach corridor. Dust had been cleared from the walkway. Fresh chalk marks appeared near several support columns. And beneath the floodgate itself sat a recently replaced wooden prayer plaque bearing the same words. Hold the level. Hold the line. I examined the floodgate controls while Ruth waited several yards back near the maintenance junction. The mechanism was completely disconnected from the active flood network. Power lines had been cut decades earlier. Yet the steel doors showed surprisingly little structural failure. Someone had been greasing certain moving parts recently. Fresh lubricant still darkened the hinge assemblies beneath layers of older corrosion. When I pointed this out, Ruth finally stepped closer and admitted the gate received one maintenance visit each year before winter. No official work orders existed for it. Retired workers simply continued the practice. The younger crews stopped believing in it, she said quietly. The older ones kept the routine anyway. The maintenance chamber contained several rusted cabinets filled with handwritten logs. Most entries documented ordinary inspections until the late 1970s. After that, the records changed. The writing became shorter and more repetitive. Nearly every annual entry ended with the same phrase, "Gate remains closed. Level held." I found no explanation for what level was being measured. Stranger still, many pages included water height readings that exceeded the physical dimensions of the corridor itself. One notation described water reaching 17 feet above the tunnel floor. The ceiling above us stood lower than that measurement. Either the records were wrong, or they described something other than floodwater. Ruth noticed me comparing the measurements and sighed softly. She said the old crews stopped discussing the numbers years ago because no explanation satisfied anyone. According to her, every generation inherited the same instructions. Inspect the gate. Replace the prayer plaque if needed. Record the level. Keep the door sealed. Most workers assumed the practice originated after some forgotten flood disaster. The problem was that nobody could find records of such a disaster in this sector. When I asked why the impossible measurements continued, Ruth answered without looking at me. Because the markings kept rising, even when the tunnel stayed dry. I walked the corridor again and counted more than 30 separate water level marks extending back through decades of inspections. The oldest lines clustered near the lower walls. The newest climbed higher and higher toward the ceiling. Several recent marks had been scratched directly into steel support columns where paint would not adhere. None showed signs of actual water damage around them. The limestone remained dry. The metal lacked flood staining. Yet the measurements were recorded with remarkable consistency across generations. While photographing the highest mark, I noticed another detail. Each line had been drawn from the same direction, facing the floodgate rather than the tunnel behind it. Late that afternoon, I asked Ruth the question she had avoided since morning. If the markings did not measure floodwater, what were they measuring? She remained silent for so long that I thought she would refuse to answer entirely. Finally, she looked toward the sealed gate and spoke in the same careful tone used for dangerous machinery. The old crew said the level belonged to whatever moved behind the door, she said. Not water. Pressure. Before I could respond, a deep metallic sound echoed through the chamber. It came from the floodgate itself. Not a collapse. Not shifting rock. A slow, deliberate knock from the sealed passage beyond. The sound came again several minutes later. 3 slow knocks. Each separated by the same interval. The steel doors did not shake. Nothing visibly moved. Yet the noise carried through the chamber with enough force to vibrate loose rust from the gate housing. I approached the doors and pressed my hand against the cold metal surface. The steel felt completely still. Ruth immediately ordered me away from it. Her reaction surprised me more than the sound itself. Until then, she had remained calm about everything I discovered. Now she looked genuinely frightened. The old crews never answered it, she said. That was the first rule. When I asked who might be knocking, she refused to respond. We spent the next hour reviewing the oldest maintenance records stored in the chamber cabinets. Most pages were damaged beyond recovery, but several entries remained legible. The earliest workers described hearing sounds from beyond the floodgate during seasonal inspections. Knocking. Scraping. Occasionally what they believed were voices. None of the reports suggested flooding. Instead, the workers repeatedly referred to rising pressure levels behind the sealed sector. One entry from the 1950s stood apart from the others. Written across an entire page were the words, "The gate does not hold water. The gate holds attention." No explanation followed. The next several pages had been removed completely. As evening approached, I noticed moisture forming along sections of the corridor floor. At first I assumed groundwater seepage had increased somewhere nearby. Then I realized the water did not originate from the cave walls. It flowed outward from beneath the floodgate itself. The amount remained small. Barely enough to form a shallow stream across the concrete channel. Yet every maintenance record insisted the gate sector had remained dry for decades. Ruth stared at the water without speaking. Then she quietly recited the phrase from the prayer plaque. "Hold the level. Hold the line." A few moments later, I found myself repeating the words with her. The water continued spreading through the chamber over the next hour. What disturbed me was not the rising level but the markings it left behind. Thin mineral residue appeared along the floor exactly where the historical measurements suggested previous levels had reached. The pattern made no physical sense. The water barely covered my boots, yet new residue lines formed several feet above us on the tunnel walls. One appeared near a marking dated 1987. Another formed beside a line from 2003. It looked as though invisible water occupied the corridor simultaneously with the real water collecting around our feet. Ruth noticed it too. Neither of us attempted to explain it. Shortly after nightfall, the chamber trembled beneath a deep mechanical groan. The floodgate machinery had finally begun to fail. Decades of corrosion gave way all at once. Rusted chains snapped overhead. Bolts sheared loose from support brackets. The massive doors shifted several inches apart before stopping. Cold air rushed from the opening beyond. I raised my flashlight and looked through the gap expecting to see flooded passages or collapsed tunnels. Instead, I saw a maintenance corridor extending into darkness. Nothing stood beyond the gate. No water. No hidden chamber. No evidence of anything requiring containment. The unsettling part was that the corridor looked completely untouched, as though nobody had ever entered it. We left immediately after the machinery failed. Before departing, I gathered the remaining records and photographed every marking throughout the sector. Several months later, spring flooding reached Mammoth Cave earlier than expected. The abandoned flood control network suffered catastrophic structural collapse. Entire sections of the sealed sector disappeared beneath rockfall and rising water. Access became permanently impossible. The recovered records eventually revealed the truth. Generations of workers had inherited maintenance rituals long after the original purpose was forgotten. No evidence suggested anything supernatural existed beyond the gate. Yet every generation recorded the same rising levels, heard the same distant sounds, and repeated the same prayers. The containment system ended when the sector collapsed. The tradition ended with it. Whatever the workers had spent decades measuring would never be recorded again.